This is Craig Brown, and welcome to Passages. Passages is a space to explore Bible passages used for preaching, reflection, and prayer. My hope is that Passages will shine a unique light on text used for preaching at the First Free Methodist Church of Seattle, or for anyone looking to dive deeper into the Bible. Today's passage is from Matthew chapter 7, verses 1 through 6. And it's the basis for the sermon at First Free Methodist Church on Sunday, February 8, 2026. It's part of our series called Hold Close: How to Make Deep Commitments with Others. So let's hear the text from Matthew chapter 7, beginning at verse 1. Jesus is speaking, and he says, "Do not judge, so that you will not be judged. For in the way you judge, you will be judged, and by your standard of measure, it will be measured to you. Why do you look at the speck that is in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that's in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, 'Let me take that speck out of your eye,' and look, the log is in your own eye? You hypocrite! First take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly how to take the speck out of your brother's eye. Do not give what is holy to the dogs, and do not throw your pearls before pigs, or they will trample them under their feet and turn and tear you to pieces." We're going to look at this text in three different segments: verses 1 through 2, then verses 3 to 5, and then finally verse 6. So let's begin with verses 1 to 2 about how judgment is measured. Now, this passage is a continuation of Jesus' teaching that we heard earlier in the Sermon on the Mount about loving our enemy. Now, there's a way to do this that ensures a balance between hypocrisy and enablement. And I would suggest that we don't need to practice either one of those things, but that the healthy place we have to find ourselves is not between those two things, but really outside of those two things. And when we talk about hypocrisy, that word in Greek literally means two-faced. Our English word hypocrisy is almost an exact transliteration, or an almost exact pronunciation of what it sounds like in Greek. It means two-faced, and you are familiar with this when you've seen the symbols for Greek drama, those two masks, one with a sad face and one with a comedic face. Those are the masks that actors would cover their faces with. The name of that mask over the face is hypocrisy. Then enablement, and that's very different from hypocrisy, in that is allowing the sin of others to grow and to thrive. So in this case, verses 1 to 5 really concern themselves with how we avoid hypocrisy. Verse 6 is how we avoid enablement. So Jesus begins this passage in verse 1 with this statement: "Do not judge," in Greek, me krenete. And what it means is it's not the prohibition of all acts of judgment. It really is a prohibition against being judgmental. He has a very specific kind of person in mind here, one who is driven by hypocrisy, an individual who looks for faults in others. They do so while ignoring their own fault. Now, the cause and effect here is that a judgmental perspective toward others will actually bring the same upon ourselves if we're guilty of it. There's kind of a mystical movement here that's more than just fairness, or as other traditions might call it, karma. It's about the state of one's own heart. Avoiding judgment does not mean that we will not be judged. It's not a cause and effect relationship like that. Our measure of gratitude towards God's mercy is at the heart of this. So if God does not judge and condemn us for our sins, then how is it that we then go out and do that to others? And Jesus expands on this verse 2 in the way in which we judge others. He further explains that the standard that we might use is the same one that will be used against us. Remember, this is not so much an act of judgment. It's really about the posture of being judgmental. And so here's the cause and effect. By embracing a standard or a way of judging others, we then create our own standard or way that is reflected back to us. So God's judgment of us is determined by the standard that we set for others. So ultimately, this is born out of our lack of gratitude for what God has done. If God is freely given and our response to that is to be judgmental of others, then we truly haven't received the free gift that God has given us. So we have to remember that these things work together, that in many ways gratitude is the exact opposite of being judgmental in some sense. And it's a key passageway for us, and it's a life of gratitude toward God embraces mercy as our standard over judgment. It's an important theological truth. God is at work in mercy and in grace. This doesn't mean the absence of judgment. When we consider all that we've received from God as a gift, it changes how we see others. But if we receive mercy, but then offer judgment, it is a witness against us. Hypocrisy is about taking what we want from God, but not giving it to others. In fact, we never received or experienced the mercy of God if this is the case. Hence, we then judge ourselves. We turn now to verses 3 to 5, and it's an expansion on this teaching on hypocrisy by Jesus. And it's about the problem of judgment. Jesus elaborates more now about this kind of danger, hypocrisy with the grace and love of God. It's a metaphor built out of his own experience as the son of a carpenter. He talks about a speck in a person's eye and a plank or a log in another person's eye. They're opposing images. So really think about being in a carpenter's workshop where there's sawdust and there's a board. And so the difference between the sawdust is the smallest measure of wood in a wood shop. It's this most minute particle. And then a whole board is much, much, much larger by a standard that is, in this case, grossly exaggerated, the comparison between the two. So judgmentalism is framed by an obsession of looking for the most minute failure or sin in others. That's the speck. And the board represents the hypocrisy, that the more we look for the most minute failure or sin in others, and in some ways, the bigger the board gets. This practice then is inversely proportional. So the more we look for the small things, the bigger our sin becomes. This is the notion of the speck in the board. Hypocrisy of looking for other people's failings actually makes our own failing larger. And so Jesus has a remedy for us. It's that embrace mercy. Embrace the reality that the more we judge, the worse it gets. And so the invitation is to receive mercy and grace ourselves so that we can be in a posture of sympathy and love for others. And this is ultimately the work of Jesus saying, you hypocrite, first take the board or the plank out of your own eye, and then you can try to help your friend take the speck out of theirs. This is the essence of our work, that we receive mercy from God and we give it to others. That's another key passageway for us here, that we fight hypocrisy with honest self-reflection and humility. We fight hypocrisy with honest self-reflection and humility. Giving the benefit of the doubt and recognizing that people's stories are actually more complex than we know will really help us here. So, often we look at behaviors and sometimes easily condemn others. And Jesus invites us to something else. Our obsession with finding fault, he tells us, is a zero-sum game. We only condemn ourselves by doing it. Yes, is there a place to judge? There is. But is there a place for judgmentalism? No. When we find ourselves complaining or being overly critical, the invitation Jesus offers us in these verses is to first look within. Remove the board from your own eye before you try to deal with anything else going on in someone else's life. He's telling us to find God's love and mercy for ourselves, and then we can try again. Now we come finally to verse 6, which is in many ways a saying or a teaching that is not as much directly related to what we read in verses 1 through 5. It's a real change of subjects. And so it's about appropriate judgment. It's in verse 6. Now, if we give others the benefit of the doubt and offer mercy more than judgment, then where's the balance? So on the one hand, if we're trying to avoid all that hypocrisy, if we're trying to give out more mercy than judgment or being judgmental, then where's the balance? So how do we not become like a doormat? Well, Jesus, does Jesus mean to say that everyone does what they want and there is no judgment at all? Of course not. Jesus concludes this small little section here in Matthew with a seemingly unrelated verse, but you got to read carefully. Now, this verse has what's called, in technical language, it's called a chiastic structure. And what that means is if I gave you the Greek letter chi, that's what chiastic, the chi and chiastic is from, it looks like the letter X. And so if I cut that letter X in half from top to bottom, what I'd have left on the right side of that would be like a sideways V with the point of the V going to the left and then the two lines moving toward the center. So this is what we mean by chiastic structure. If you look at this verse, that means the way it's arranged is very careful. It's a bit of a proverb here. And so Jesus says, don't give what's holy to the dogs. That's the first line. But I want you to notice how it matches the statement at the end of the saying in verse 6, for they will tear you to pieces. See how the beginning and the end go together, and then the two middle parts go together. So if you were to outline it a bit, it would look like holy to dogs is A1, then pearls to swine would be B1, trample underfoot would be B2, and tear you to pieces would be A2. So you can kind of see this outline form that goes from A to B, then B to A. And that's what that chiastic structure means. So that means when you read this verse, the chiastic structure can help you. Like if it's holy to dogs, the saying that matches it is tear you to pieces. If we say don't give that which is holy or give your pearls to swine, we know that which goes with us is they would trample under feet. Okay, pigs don't tear you to pieces. So you see how there's a kind of a matching work that goes on in each of these statements. Now let's talk about some of the words here. The term dogs was used by Jews in Jesus' time as a derogatory term for Gentiles. Many Gentile households had domesticated dogs in them. They were considered to be coveted pets, and in some ways the way they are today. But those who were poorer typically couldn't afford to keep pets. So typically a dog was something that wealthier individuals had. But the idea was that Gentiles typically kept dogs as their domesticated pets. And so it became kind of a slang word amongst Jews to refer to Gentiles as dogs. And then swine is something else that's closely related to Judaism, of course, because it references pigs and pork, which is unclean by kosher law. So if you were to imagine the most unclean animal there is to eat, according to the Jewish tradition, a pig is certainly on the list. And a pig is an animal that's had a history throughout the history of the Jews, not just barely 100 years before the time of Jesus. There was a Greek, kind of a Greek governor who oversaw the area around Jerusalem. His name was Alexander Jannaeus, and he slaughtered a pig in the Jewish temple. It was quite controversial. So the idea of a pig here is important in the saying that Jesus is offering us. So by holy, Jesus is saying that which is sacred or valuable, and by pearls, Jesus is saying something that is small but valuable. So don't give what's holy to the dogs, and do not give your pearls to swine. All right? So the notion here is that these things are not to be given to those who have no respect for either. Otherwise, it will result in the destruction of both. All right? The pigs will simply trample on the pearls, and the dogs are just going to tear to pieces whatever is given to them that's holy. So there is a place for judgment, according to Jesus. So that which is precious should not be given where there is a proven rejection. Now, Matthew, writing this, clearly has in mind the proclamation of the gospel, in that you don't keep offering it where it's rejected. So part of what we read throughout Matthew's gospel, in that the people to whom his gospel is written, is it's written to Christian communities that are still functioning as kind of missionaries abroad in the ancient world. And so there's kind of this teaching here that we read in other parts of Matthew, where Jesus sends out the 12, sends out the 70, and he tells them, when you go to a town or a village and they don't welcome you, wipe the dust off your feet and move on. This is kind of the same thing. You don't keep offering this good gift when it's been rejected. Just pick it up and then move on to the next place. There'll be another opportunity. It's very kind of a key theme in Matthew's gospel about how this happens. But there's still a little bit more here. It talks about that that in doing so, we deepen the sin of others by continually wounding them with our well-intended actions. So we keep bringing the gospel, and all that does is it continues to entrench their bitterness and resentment against it. It's like if you keep offering something to a person over and over and over and over again, eventually they get to a point where they get fed up and they respond in a way that's maybe not as nuanced about continually being offered something. And so this is the balance with hypocrisy. Hypocrisy is kind of the over-meddling in other people's lives, whereas this is about trying to engage people and offering them good things that are well-intended in their life that they're not ready to receive. So we also need to hold some judgment about saying, well, maybe it's time to move on. And this has really a lot to do with enablement, that well-intended acts, sometimes in certain settings, can create difficulties for people. And that's a key passageway for us. Followers of Jesus can never further sin through enablement. Jesus is speaking here about, in many ways, patterns of abuse. Pigs and dogs are destructive when given these precious things. So our work that we do as followers of Jesus has to find a balance between loving others and not enabling them. We love unconditionally, yet we do not unconditionally enable sin and brokenness. And it's a very careful nuance for us to find here as we wonder about what it means to enable others, in the same way of having alcohol out in front of an alcoholic, or having controlled substances or drugs in front of someone who's a user. This is very much the same thing. We don't want to be engaging in things that cause people to unnecessarily stumble and sin on our part. Now, I want to thank you all for listening to this week's podcast. I look forward to preaching and sharing this time with you about this text coming up soon. Listen in for our sermon podcast every week as a part of the FFMC podcast. And I also encourage you to listen for our conversational podcast that we publish about every month called Connections. You can find them all right here in the FFMC podcast. This podcast, Passages, our sermon podcast, and our conversational podcast called Connections. I also want to encourage you to visit our church's website at ffmc.org to learn more about Free Methodism and how you can connect with our community. For now, I bid you all grace. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.